2.
It should be good now.
Awesome. Welcome back. I'm registered dietitian Myrna Haag, where I try to bring you some really good information. I want to share with you on nutrition things that I think are super impactful and can make a difference knowing them in your life. What we're going to talk about in this video is type 3 diabetes. Now, the thumbnail I have up is a little strong statement because we're going to get to it in a minute, but it talks about type 3 diabetes. A lot of people aren't sure what that is. It's Alzheimer's and how diet causes it. Now, we really can't say that, medically speaking, but I think once you get through the video tonight, you're going to see some really interesting correlations between diet and Alzheimer's. I'm going to bring you the science, right? So I'm going to bring you the biochemistry, and I'm going to bring you the studies with it. According to the CDC, Center for Disease Control, 5.8 million people over the age of 65, 2020, have Alzheimer's, okay? And that is projected to grow, double, I should say, every 5 years. And that to me is mind-blowing. But what is truly mind-blowing is how that correlates with the increase of type 2 diabetes. So when we look at Alzheimer's disease, there's a lot of different pathologies. I said there's a lot of different ways that they're showing medically that can cause this. But what I'm talking about in this video is one that's really, I believe, fairly preventable by knowing how to eat. So if Sam will switch it over, let's get right into it. All right. So type 3 diabetes, Alzheimer's disease. First, I want to really talk about where I get some of my education and who I look to are, especially in this particular video, Dr. Scott Summers, and he teaches at the University of Utah, and he has spent really the majority of his life researching type 2 diabetes to find a cure. And I love that. I love biochemists that are like, that's their goal. And it's really interesting to read some of his papers, and I have read a lot of his papers. In here, it talks about Professor Summers has been a dominant voice advancing the idea that sphingolipids, such as ceramides, and we're going to talk about those, are produced from overnutrition, overeating, and inflammation, and they contribute to insulin resistance and metabolic diseases. His work has appeared in the highest impact journals, Nature Medicine, Cell Metabolism, Journal of Clinical Investigation, and others, and has been cited over 8,000 times. He has given over 100 presentations in at least 20 different countries and a lot of keynote talks. So he's also has a $10 million research grant that he's working on in regards to type 2 diabetes. And what we'll talk about are these ceramides. So thank you, Dr. Summers. Thank you for your research. Thank you for your papers. I also have another favorite one of my podcasts that I listen to is a biochemist, Dr. Guerrero, and Dr. Guerrero has a lot of interesting podcasts on the biochemistry of fats. And this particular one, he talks about ceramides and the sphingolipids, which we're going to talk about in this video, and how these are really instrumental into type 2 diabetes and Alzheimer's. So let's get moving. First of all, type 3 diabetes, if you were to PubMed it, and you put in your search engine PubMed for public medicine, type 3 diabetes, you would see all the studies that come up. And every one of them, when we talk about type 3 diabetes, they're going to have in there Alzheimer's disease is a type 3 diabetes, the role and implication of Alzheimer's. So this is, I think, a fair assessment that this is out there and it's real. Type 3 diabetes is a real thing. Now, it's not a real medical word, I should say. It's more what we call it because of the pathology of the disease and what I'm going to explain to you in this video. So what we're going to talk about in this video is, can you test for Alzheimer's? Does diet prevent this? And should you be changing your eating habits? And how do you prevent it? And what do you do as far as food when you already have it? So we're going to get this covered. First of all, when we talk about type 3 diabetes, a lot of people are like, well, what exactly is that? Type 3 is when certain brain cells do not have access to sugar. Now, I have a couple videos that I talk about with diabetes type 2. I have one that at the end of this video I'll share with you that you can watch. If you found the information in this helpful, you're going to really love the information in those two. But basically, we have type 1 diabetes, type 2 diabetes. Well, we actually have type 1 and type 1.5, which is this adult onset diabetes, which we're going to talk about in this video, how some of these ceramides could be responsible for some of these adult onset diabetes. And then we have what we're going to talk about is type 3. Now, the most important common denominator in this is the receptor sites, which we're going to talk about, that insulin attaches to becomes defective. Okay, it doesn't work like it should, and then the muscle cell or the brain cell, which we're going to talk about here, becomes resistant to the action of insulin, which means that the sugar isn't getting into the muscle cell. So the role of insulin and the role it plays in regards to brain homeostasis of energy is that it helps shuttle sugar into that brain cell. And in this study, it says that the Alzheimer's disease is a type 3 diabetes is common. And what are they saying here in regards to it being in association with type 2? It says research findings are presented to underline the vital role that insulin plays in the brain's neurotransmitters, the homeostasis of energy, as well as memory capacity. The findings of this review indicate the existence of a mechanistic interplay between Alzheimer's pathogenesis, that means the pathology, that means the actual disease, and type 2 diabetes. And this is all about insulin signaling. Both of them are in regards to that, which then leads to neural inflammation, oxidative stress, advanced glycation, and mitochondrial dysfunction. All of this is related to metabolic syndrome. Bottom line, all of this together is what leads to these amyloid plaques. Just like we get plaque in the arteries, we can get the same type of plaque in the brain, but the problem is when it's in the brain and you get the plaque in the brain, it's irreversible. And that's where it can have some real disruption in our brain capacity, which is what we talk about. We talk about dementia and all this cognitive impairment. So let's get right down into it and talk about studies, because I always say, look, there's a lot of word salad out there. A lot of people are throwing around, well, this and that, and you're listening to it on the internet. And it's so hard if you don't have that biochemistry background or you don't have the medical background to really figure out if you're supposed to be impressed with all the big words they're using, because they're throwing them around, and a lot of times you're just buying into it because it sounds like it's super important and they really know what they are talking about, but it's just a lot of words thrown together that don't really get to any conclusion. And I think this is a really good example. I pulled it up because I want to feel for you as far as going to the internet, my patients come to me all the time and say, look, is this stuff valid? I can't, believe how much stuff out there that's so contradictory, okay? So I totally get it. This particular word salad study talks about dietary fats and gut microbiota and their impact on lipid-induced metabolic syndrome, which is fat-induced metabolic problems. And when you read this, it's all over the place. First of all, they start off by saying that dietary fats increase the risk of cardiovascular disease. And then they say the Mediterranean diet with fats may reduce the risk. So 1 minute they're saying fats increase the risk, but then they talk about the Mediterranean-rich diet, these unsaturated fats. Well, this could maybe lower it. Of course, they're not really giving you any biochemistry. Then the very next sentence, they talk about energy-dense, high fats that promotes obesity and insulin resistance. So in 1 minute, they're talking about the Mediterranean diet, and some of these unsaturated fats may help prevent diabetes. And then the next line, they talk about energy-dense, high-fat diet actually promotes it. So this is really hard and confusing when you're trying to get an answer. And to me, this is where a lot of people cherry pick. They'll find a study, they'll pick what they like about it, and they'll say, oh, right there, it says Mediterranean diet, and we're bringing in those saturated, unsaturated fats. It can actually help. So I think when you look at studies, you've really got to be looking at the biochemistry. That's how I look at it. You got to be able to explain it in a very scientific way, and then those studies have to match that. Okay, so a lot of times we'll see studies and they'll be doing meta-analysis. And this talks about a meta-analysis, which means they're just looking at a bunch of different studies. And it shows that there's insufficient evidence to link a high-fat diet contributing to saturated fats with an increase in cardiovascular disease. So they're saying, well, we don't have enough evidence. And so they say, because we don't have enough evidence, we're going to take the dietary guidelines and we're not going to really worry about it. We think that a low-fat diet is probably not very good because some of the consequences of a low-fat diet, which we're going to talk about in this video. So it's all over the place. But what really just baffles me is for 2015 to 2020, the dietary guidelines kind of removed the upper limit of total fat intake. They said, well, we're looking at these studies. We're not really sure. There's not really enough sufficient evidence. Of course, they don't tell you the evidence. They don't really tell you much. But what we're going to do is we're going to change the dietary guidelines. Now, as a registered dietitian, I cannot tell you how this, it just infuriates me. Okay? Because as registered dietitians, we go to school to learn the biochemistry of all the macronutrients, and then these guys just look at some evidence and decide, oh, all that's going to change. What I'm going to show you is how there's science behind why we want to have a certain amount of fats, protein, fibers, and carbohydrates. There's actually science behind that. We don't just make it up if we don't find any evidence. That's like saying we're telling millions of people dietary guidelines because, well, we just didn't find enough evidence in these studies, which is to me absolutely crazy, and why I'm passionate to bring the information to you, because I want to show you there is science behind this. So let's go to the next slide and talk about the actual pathology of this. What is actually going on? We're going to specifically talk about the brain. When we talk about insulin resistance, what is going on here is that every time you eat a carbohydrate, that carbohydrate goes into the bloodstream and it has a job. The job is to, as glucose, get inside a muscle cell and get inside a brain cell. And if there's any left over, it's going inside a fat cell, which we don't really want that, right? So how this works is these carbohydrates are rushing to these muscle cells. You're covered in them, so we're going to get a lot more coverage there, right? A lot more glucose is going to want to show up in muscle cells, but also in brain cells, because brain cells want to have that glucose. In order for that glucose to get inside those cells, the hormone insulin is also released at the same time the carbohydrate is digested and absorbed into the bloodstream. The insulin attaches to a receptor site. When it attaches to a receptor site, it sends chemicals through the cell, the neuronal cells, the cells in the brain, and this allows a transporter to come to the surface of those cells, and that is what allows the sugar inside the brain cells. The same goes on with the muscle cells, is that when insulin attaches to this receptor site on the muscle cell, that is when the transporter comes to the surface. So there's actually a communication that goes on inside the cell, which we're going to talk about tonight, specifically in the brain cell. But here's where things go south. These receptor sites become disabled. So what happens is, because of a lot of excess circulating fats, which we'll talk about, turn into a type of fat called a ceramide. These ceramides accumulate and they actually disable the receptor sites, and that is when the transporters are unable to come to the surface of those neuronal cells, unable to come to the surface of the muscle cells to allow the glucose inside. So what happens is the glucose builds up outside the muscle cell, builds up outside the brain cell, and this is where it gets really hairy. Because when you have a lot of glucose circulating in the bloodstream, not a good thing. Because this glucose can actually cause a lot of defect in cells that are not designed to have a lot of glucose. So the glucose can go inside, can travel through, can affect cells, the nerve cells, can affect everything cells that do not have these receptors. And this is where we can have neuropathy, we have damage, it actually damages nerve cells. This is what we'll see with diabetics. And actually this excess sugar can damage brain cells. So I get it. I get why everybody's saying, wow, let's really take out the sugar of the blood so we don't have all this sugar going in there and damaging these other areas, because you have a problem with this receptor site. Because ideally the sugar was designed to get inside the muscle cell and the brain cell, but because you have this defective area in the receptor that is unable to allow the transporter, then it's okay, let's now control the sugar in the blood. But really, the root cause is right here. This is the root cause of type 3 diabetes and type 2 diabetes. So when it's in the muscle, it's type 2 diabetes, and when it's in the brain, it's type 3. But what is causing this? It's a certain type of fats called ceramides. And this is what Dr. Summers has spent his life researching, is how these ceramides work, because these ceramides are very instrumental for causing a lot of neurodegenerative diseases. These ceramides disrupt this insulin receptor site and cause a cascade to happen. So let's go there and zero in on the brain and talk about this cascade that contributes to Alzheimer's, to dementia. So how this receptor site works, this is above the cell, but beneath the cell, we have these long strands, and it uses a tyrosine serine kinase activity, and who cares about that? But what that means is it uses a chemical reaction to more or less bring these strands together, which communicate and talk to other chemicals in the brain, allow the transporter to come to the surface. It's a beautiful thing. It's how it's supposed to happen. But in these strands, it does not allow this transporter to allow the sugar in the brain, because these ceramides, excess fatty acids that are in circulation. So when you have a lot of excess fats in circulation because you're eating too much dietary fats, or maybe you just have too much body fat, and body fat breaks down and releases these fatty acids begin to accumulate in muscles. They begin to accumulate in liver. They begin to accumulate in cells that are not designed for fat, like fat cells. So fat cells are designed for fat, but some of these other cells are not. And as these fats begin to accumulate, like for instance, fatty liver disease, that's where we're going to have elevated triglycerides. That's where we're going to see a lot of these fats accumulating in the liver, and we'll talk about the root cause of that. And then it creates chemically a fat called a ceramide. Same with the muscle. But what makes it really disturbing is these ceramides can leave these cells and they can travel in the bloodstream, which we now have tests that can measure them. And these ceramides can go up through the blood-brain barrier and it can affect the insulin receptor site. And what it does is it does not allow these two strands to do their chemical action. It actually stops the autophosphorylation. That is that chemical hit that happens that allows this transporter to bring sugar into the brain. So what that means is sugar isn't going to get into the neuronal cells properly. You can have a lot of excess sugar circulating in places we don't want it. What happens when these ceramides do this, they also cause what are called reactive oxygen species. I also call them free radicals. And these begin to come to the brain, as well as immune cells like the tumor necrosis factor. And these cells also all go into that area. They're all centered around the ceramide populated area. But what makes it worse is these reactive oxygen species can themselves go and damage neuronal cells. Same with tumor necrosis factor. These immune cells cause a lot of inflammation in the brain. And this is where we're going to start seeing the breakdown of the myelin sheaths. We're going to start to see the plaque in the brain form because of all these agents in there. But one of the biggest culprits is these excess fatty acids that are coming from muscles and from other cells, peripheral cells, that were not designed for fat storage, because we have what's called lipid toxicity, excess fatty acid. And Dr. Summers, in many of his papers, refers to this lipid toxicity, this fat toxicity, as being very toxic. And this is what causes these ceramides, which then brings the whole cascade of reactive oxygen species, which can go in and damage neuronal cells. You've got immune cells that increase the inflammation. And all of this is going on because of type 3 diabetes. So if we look at some of the studies, let's go back and talk about some of the studies with some of these ceramides. And this talks about the triangular malsignaling in Alzheimer's disease and the roles of neurotoxic ceramides. Insulin resistance reviewed. And this talks about these toxic ceramides that are released into the blood. Remember, it's type 2 diabetes first in the muscle tissue. So the muscle tissue has these ceramides developing because of a lot of these excess fatty acids that are circulating, and they begin to get into these muscle cells in excess. This is this lipid toxicity. And when these fatty acids do that, then they change into a ceramide. They actually cause a very toxic type of fat that causes damage in that insulin receptor in the muscle. And as these ceramides begin to populate that insulin receptor site, it also brings more inflammatory cells, but they can circulate. These ceramides circulate, they go up to the blood-brain barrier, and now they affect the brain. And when they affect the brain, they also recruit other immune cells that are inflammatory. They recruit what are called reactive oxygen species. Now, these are called oxidizers. And I know you guys have heard of antioxidants. So these oxidizers are just part of our human physiology. We make them in the mitochondria. A certain amount are not so bad. But when you have an excess of these reactive oxygen species, they create a lot of oxidation, which is what degrades a lot of the neuronal cells in the brain. And this is a form of cognitive decline. So in a diet perspective, we want to neutralize these reactive oxygen species by taking antioxidants, because these are oxidizers. Remember, they got there because of the insulin receptor site was filled with ceramides that triggered this cascade going on in the brain. Now, I want to mention, When we talk about Alzheimer's, I'm going to talk about the diet when you have it and then how to prevent it, because those are two different types of diets. And I want you to catch in this visual that obviously if you have a defective receptor and you can't get sugar into the places it's supposed to go, it means you now have a problem with sugar. And what's interesting with diabetes type 2 and type 3 is that once you get the problem of excess fatty acids causing the condition, then you have a problem with sugar and insulin. But I always say in my videos, sugar and insulin are not the root cause of the disease. They are the byproducts. They're the end result. In other words, you're going to have a problem with excess insulin and you're going to have a problem with excess glucose when you have these ceramides causing dysfunction in the receptor site. But to just focus on removing the glucose from the blood because you're going to do a low-carb diet doesn't mean you literally reverse the disease. And this is where I see with a lot of my patients that are athletes, and they're doing great. They have no sign of type 2 diabetes. Their A1C, which is the measurement of the glucose in the blood, everything's low. And then long and behold, they're so confused because all of a sudden, as they approach 60, 65, which is why a lot of 60, 65-year-olds get type 2 diabetes. This is where we see the largest population of cognitive decline, Alzheimer's, because the two go together, type 2, type 3. But they're just shocked because they're seeing prediabetes and they cannot make higher hair of it. They just are very confused because they tell me, I eat a healthy diet, I eat avocados and I eat nuts and I eat olive oil, and look at me, I exercise, I'm at my perfect weight. And by the way, Myrna, everything you're telling me goes against what everybody else is saying, because they're all telling me because I have type 2 diabetes, because I have a prediabetes, because I have a 5.1 or a 5.9, anything over 5.7 is pre-diabetic, and they're telling me that what I need to do is I need to take the sugar out of my diet. Well, yeah, I definitely believe you should take sugar out of your diet, but they're telling them to do a low-carb diet. And the reason why that is so popular is because it does curtail the symptoms. So when you do a low-carb diet, yes, the sugar in the blood will be less, the sugar in the brain will be less, the symptoms will be curtailed, but the root cause of the disease did not get fixed. And the worst part of this is you're still going to get those ceramides circulating and can cause other issues, cardiovascular disease, kidney dysfunction, and even contribute to type 1 diabetes, because these ceramides can go into the pancreas and kill the very beta cells that are making the insulin in the first place. Now, obviously, if we do a lot of carbs, it's a problem because you can have a lot of insulin action. I'm not going to really go into it in this video about balancing the macronutrients. I do have a video that I do explain that. I want to really take home the whole idea of what is type 3 diabetes, how it relates to type 2, and how we are really getting some of these diet recommendations a little confusing. So when we have this type 3 diabetes, we also are going to have an impaired brain energy metabolism. And I want to go over this study, and then I want to talk about it from a biochemistry perspective. So back to the study where I talk about the triangular malsignaling in Alzheimer's disease. Now you know what that means. It's up in that insulin receptor site. And in this study, it says there's two major pathways that overlap in Alzheimer's disease and neurodegeneration, and it's about malsignaling network. And they talk about here in the green highlight, reviewed evidence that a systematic insulin resistance disease is linked to obesity, type 2 diabetes, and fatty liver disease, which also promote neurodegeneration, which means a breakdown of brain cells. And it talks later in this study, in the highlighted area in yellow, toxic ceramides generated in the central nervous system tissues like the liver and the muscles get released into the bloodstream, okay? And they transit through the blood-brain barrier into the brain. And they induce brain insulin resistance, which I just showed you the pathology of that. I just showed you the biochemistry on that. And it also increases inflammation because it recruits those TNF immune cells. And it causes cell death. Yes, it does. And so a lot of those neuronal cells can get corrupt. And this will lead to, it goes on to say, neurodegeneration, and brain insulin resistance is part of it, but it impairs the energy metabolism, which we'll talk about, because now you can't tolerate a lot of sugar once you get this cognitive impairment, but the diet to prevent it is the exact opposite diet once you have it. And I think that's really confusing for people, and I feel I really want to straighten that out. And this talks about the amyloid beta protein secretion, the ABPP, and this is the result of this inflammation, this neurodegenerative disorder that's going on in the brain, these reactive oxygen species. This is what creates the insulin resistance in the brain. Brain insulin resistant, cell death, as it's stated here. Let me just kind of put it in red. And this malon degeneration. So the malon sheaths are what wrap a lot of these axons, what wrap a lot of these brain neurons, okay? And this leads to this inflammation, this neuroinflammation, which is really this whole area that I'm referring to is mediated by toxic ceramides. And I think that is, to me, huge. I think a lot of people aren't getting the whole science on it. But I want you guys to be able to see the science like I see it, and then be able to do some deductive reasoning, right? Because it's one thing to have somebody just sit here and read studies and studies to you, but then to be able to actually see it, to have somebody draw you the picture and say, this is where it goes and what it does. Hopefully it makes some sense when I'm doing the studies, but then it's going to make a whole lot of sense when I talk about the diet recommendations, because you're actually seeing the path. Well, what we have to realize with insulin resistance is it's going to decrease glycogen uptake. It's going to decrease the glucose into the muscle cell. It's going to decrease your capacity to even store carbohydrates. And I'm going to get to that point in a minute, because this is where we can really see how diet affects us to prevent the disease and once we have it, which are two different diets. Insulin resistance obviously means you're going to have less glucose uptake. You will also have less protein synthesis, because part of the job of the insulin when it attaches to the receptor site is to actually increase glucose uptake, right? Get it where it's supposed to go. And it also helps with protein synthesis, which is why a lot of times with diabetics and Alzheimer's disease, you're going to see a lot of muscle atrophy, right? Because it's not working like it should. And also, I am going to talk about the carbohydrate uptake in the muscle, because I noticed with one of my last videos, we had a lot of questions on that. People were really confused because I am recommending carbs, but I really want to talk about the capacity of the carbs in the muscle so that we get a little more clarity. So in this particular study, metabolic messengers, which are the ceramides, in the late 1990s, studies by a group demonstrated these ceramides inhibited this insulin glucose uptake. And it talked about how it activated this kinase, serine, threonine. Not that that's a really big deal, but these are some of the chemicals that get these enzymes that get activated inside that cell so that glucose transporter can allow the sugar in the cell. Too much science, let's forget about it. But what I do want you to remember here is that it does inhibit the protein synthesis and glucose uptake. And this is all linked to these ceramides. And one of the other important points in this study, the metabolic messengers, is it talks about that the ceramides, that they absolutely will inhibit the amount of glucose in the muscle cell and the amino acids, which are the proteins, and it leads to a preferential utilization of fatty acids for energy. And this is going to be huge, because this is where a lot of confusion comes in, because when you have insulin resistance, it's almost as if that mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell where you're getting the energy, is actually preferring fatty acids for energy. Well, in some ways it's kind of forced to, right? Because it's not getting the glucose it would like. But this affects your metabolism downstream. And I think that's really important to talk about, because I think hopefully it will clear up a lot of confusion when you hear people tell you, do you do a low-fat diet, high-fat diet, low-carb diet? What I want people to understand is that these ceramides actually decrease, as it says, number 4, mitochondrial efficiency. They actually cause your metabolism to change. And this inhibits the amount of ATP that's produced. That's the energy that's produced by these fatty acids. So it actually means that your body wants to burn more fatty acids. I'm not saying that that's a good thing, because you have insulin resistance, and I don't think insulin resistance is where we want to be. We want to reverse that. But it makes a lot of sense why low carb diets are recommended. They're not the answer. The answer is to properly balance your diet. That's what I teach people to do, is I teach them how to bring the macronutrients in the right percentages through your diet, not by following an imbalanced diet because you have an imbalance, which is kind of crazy, because that's what you're doing when you take out all the carbs. The key is to understand how to eat to manage the carbs, not remove them. So, but the mitochondria does change that, and it's not a good thing. Ceramides actually slow lipolysis by blocking the activation of these hormone-sensitive lipases, which are enzymes that allow fat breakdown. So the metabolism changes with insulin resistance. We do see weight gain. It's tougher to maintain your weight, but what this video is talking about is cognitive decline in relationship to that. It impairs brain energy metabolism. It decreases the glucose uptake. It decreases protein synthesis. Ceramides decrease mitochondrial efficiency. You have less ATP. This encourages your mitochondria, which is the powerhouse of the cell, to burn more fatty acids. And it leads to a preferred utilization of fatty acids for energy. Ceramides slow down fat breakdown. So a lot of people say, well, are you saying that if I have insulin resistance, then I should do a high-fat diet? I'm saying if you have insulin resistance, it's logical that your body would want a high-fat diet, but you're just going to contribute more to the disease worsening. We have to understand that we have to know how to eat for it. That's where I'm going to try to really educate you guys with my YouTube videos, help you understand how to do this. When we look at the roles of ceramides in fatty liver disease, again, what's amazing to me, and this study sheds light on, is fatty liver affects 25% of the general population. And if you have fatty liver, your triglycerides are going to be elevated, and you're definitely going to be with this lipid toxicity. That is going to be a for sure thing, because that's what fatty liver is. The liver has a lot of fats. These fats can also increase the ceramide release into circulation, which can then affect the brain cells and can contribute to type 3 diabetes. So fatty liver disease, you're going to see elevated triglycerides. Triglycerides are fatty acids that are tied down. There's 3 fatty acids tied down. When they're a triglyceride, they're fairly stable, but when they leave a storage place like fats or the liver, these triglycerides become fatty acids. And these excess fatty acids circulate, and when they start to accumulate in other cells like muscle cells, fatty liver cells, when they start to accumulate in other cells, that's when the body chemically changes them to a ceramide, and then the cycle begins. And that's where we're getting this contribution. Let me see if I can get my slides. I might need a little technical help here, Samantha. Okay, hold on a minute. I think I got it. Yeah, there we go. So, elevated triglycerides aren't just about eating fats. They're about overeating. They're about your body having too much body fat. I'm not going to talk about fatty liver in the sense of fructose is a huge contributor. That's a sugar. I think that's another podcast to talk about fatty liver particularly. I just wanted to shed light on the fact of its association with Alzheimer's and insulin resistance in the brain. But fatty liver, I think we probably see them. We probably should put that on our list, because I think that's another really good thing to talk about and how diet affects that. But more studies, and I want to show you that there's just so many studies out there. This is, 2022, but some of them even go back to 2010, 2015 in the medical journals. And it talks about lard works in mysterious ways. Ceramides in nutrition linked to chronic disease. And this is definitely one of the studies from Dr. Summers. And it talks about how diet influences the onset progression of several chronic diseases, including heart failure, because yes, those ceramides can travel to the heart, diabetes, which I explained that, fatty liver disease, and also a subset for certain cancers. So the prevalence and the clinical burden of these obesity-linked diseases has risen over the past 2 decades. Well, so has everything else in regards to cardiovascular disease. And these metabolic disorders, the reason why they're metabolic disorders is because they're affecting that glucose, they're affecting your energy. That's what makes it that metabolic disorder. This is driven by lipid, which is fat deposits in area that are not suited for fat storage. Ceramides are one of the worst kind. They're one of the most bioactive metabolites that occur. And they are participating in this insulin resistance, elevated lipids, which we will see with our lipid panel, cholesterols, our LDLs, and oxidative stress, which are those reactive oxygen species. And apoptosis means it kills the cell. So when we look at oxidative stress, I'm going to just take you right back there for a minute, because it's always good to make sure we understand. It's these guys right here, reactive oxygen species, that are triggered anytime we have inflammation. You're going to see these reactive oxygen species. I've talked about them in a lot of my other videos. These are major disease promoters because they're major inflammatory disruptors. And these oxidizing agents can be neutralized with antioxidants. And let's now talk about the diet. And we'll get into the antioxidants. So, to prevent Alzheimer's disease and the diet once you have the disease. Now, if I would have brought this slide first, it wouldn't have made a bit of sense to any of you. But now that I'm going to talk about it, hopefully we're going to use the biochemistry to support the reasoning. So diet to prevent Alzheimer's disease. You want to balance your macronutrients, protein, fiber, carbs, and fat. This, to me, folks, is really the holy grail. This is how we do it. We just have to know how to do it. Fat, anywhere from 25 to 35%. That's going to be anywhere from 40 to 80 grams a day of fat. A lot of people go, oh, that's crazy. That's too low. I'm not talking a low-fat diet. It's the fat percentage based on your ideal body weight, not what you weigh now. So if you're 100 pounds overweight, I'm not saying 25 or 30% of what you weigh. It's what you ideally should weigh. That percentage is where we take those fat percentages. Really changes the picture for you, doesn't it? Because we're talking about your ideal body weight percentages for your macronutrient fat. That's 40 to 80 grams. If you're little like me, right, it's going to be 40 to 50 grams. If you're a bigger person, maybe 70 to 80 grams. 1 tablespoon of olive oil is 15 grams. 1 serving of nut is 15 grams. 1 avocado is 22 grams. These are all healthy fats. I am not disputing that. But in excess, the science is showing us it can be a problem. In excess, and that's the big word here. And here we're looking at the word salad study, and I'll go back there, and they were using recommendations based on and upping this whole fat recommendation based on looking at some, I guess, I don't know if they were looking at population studies. I got to find my word salad. But bottom line, this is crazy. Because I'm bringing you the science, and they're just looking at certain studies, and since they didn't see a lot of evidence, they just linked a high-fat diet containing saturated fats with an increase of cardiovascular disease, not to really be, they didn't see enough evidence to support that. When I'm showing you a ton of evidence, but regardless, they went ahead and they changed their dietary guidelines for Americans, and they removed the upper limit of total fat intake. And we're wondering why we're seeing such an increase in type 2 diabetes. Well, I didn't make up the science on the ceramides. I didn't make up the biochemistry on that. That's the real deal. That's how it works. And then to bring you the studies that also support that, all I'm saying to you is many different people are talking about this, scientists. It's not just Dr. Summers, although he's been, I think, a real pioneer in this. A lot of people are saying, wow, this is the science behind how this all works. So the diet makes sense to manage your macronutrients in the right way. And I don't understand why we would want excess fats, why we would want to eat all these excess fats. I know they taste good. I'm talking about the health ramifications. And with protein, it's 20 to 25%. And a real easy formula for that is you take your body weight, you divide it by 2.2, and you multiply it by 1.2. Now, there's some studies that say with aging, you can multiply it by 1.4. Bottom line, the bigger you are, right, the more protein you're going to need. And then carbohydrates are anywhere from 40 to 55%. And I'm going to go over that next because this is where I got a lot of, no, that can't be so. So we're going to talk about that. What does that mean? So with carbohydrates, this is also based on your ideal body weight percentage, not what you weigh now. So if you're, 60 pounds overweight, I'm not saying it should be 40 to 55% of what you're eating now, because you're probably eating way too many carbs. I'm saying at your ideal body weight. So I want your fat grams what it should be for your ideal body weight. I want your carbohydrate grams what it should be for your ideal body weight. But your protein grams, I want it for what you weigh now. You know why? Because we got to maintain what you weigh now. I don't want you to have muscle atrophy. But when it comes to the fats and the carbs, it's what you should weigh. And let's look at carbohydrates, because I did get a lot of questions on carbs. So inside the muscle, which is where most of these carbs like to be stored, because remember the picture, we got glucose running to the muscles, trying to get inside the muscles so that it can be stored for energy. Yes, you can use fats, and like I said, when you have insulin resistance and we're unable to get the sugar into the muscle cell, then the muscle cell begins to want to burn more fat. That's just sort of natural. But that can contribute to this vicious cycle of more insulin resistance. It's kind of crazy, but that's what we're seeing and why we're at epidemic levels and why I'm so passionate about delivering this information to you. So here's how it works with carbohydrates. The carbohydrates actually have a capacity load. In other words, if you're super athletic, you exercise every day, muscles will have a higher glycogen capacity. They'll actually be able to absorb more carbs and they'll demand more carbs. So if you're an exerciser at a gym, now remember I said the average range is 150 to 250 grams of carbs. And then if you go exercise for an hour, you can easily add anywhere from 30 to 60 grams on top of that if you're out there doing a spin class. But 150 is a big spread. So let's talk about this spread so it makes sense to you. If you are really super active, those muscles are going to want to have more carbs. Your capacity to store carbs will be higher because you're active. If you are insulin resistant, your capacity will be less because the muscles aren't getting a lot of the carbs. Also, if you're insulin resistant, you have morbid obesity, which means, you're carrying maybe 100 pounds or maybe 60 pounds overweight. That means that your capacity for carbs will be less. So for you to do 40% of your ideal body weight of carbs, or maybe even with morbid obesity, you might even be able to do 35%. That may be down at the lower end of carbs. But you can't ask somebody who's active and has a higher capacity for carbs in the muscle. You can't ask him to do 40%. They're going to have some issues. They're not going to be able to sustain it. What's going to happen is they're going to binge on carbs. And that's what I talk about when I teach my course, because I have a course where I teach you how to eat. And I show that this has got to make science sense, guys, okay? It isn't about an opinion where one day I wake up and say, okay, we're going to do this diet and that diet. It has to do with the macronutrients and how they work. So I just wanted to share that because if you have insulin resistance, and you're overweight, or maybe you have diabetes, then yes, your carbohydrate capacity will be less. And I'm not saying you can just eat carbs whenever you want. You have to know how to time them. You bring protein and fiber when you eat your carbs so you can control that glycemic reaction in the bloodstream. But back to Alzheimer's, because that's what we're here to talk about. When we're looking at the diet to prevent it, it's about maintaining a diet, really, for most people, would seem like a low-fat diet. It's really not. It's going to be really monitoring those fats, hopefully bringing in all the good fats, keeping the protein, what you need for your body size, bringing in carbohydrates, but you want to use the protein and the fiber to combine with those carbohydrates. And the carbohydrates are based on your ideal body weight, so maybe 180 grams of carbs throughout the day with protein and fiber. Of course, if you're insulin resistant and you have a lot of excess body weight, you're not active, it could be down to 150 grams of carbs. But once you get more active and you start losing the weight, your carb percentage is going to go up. And that's the key point. That's the key point. It's based on the macronutrients, not locking into a diet because your neighbor told you about it. Well, here's where, and this is to me how you prevent Alzheimer's, is you eat a whole food diet, a lot of fibers. Fibers are huge. I'll talk a little bit about those. You got to balance the carbs, you got to bring in the protein, and you got to keep the fats at the right percentage. Once you have Alzheimer's, this is where the studies talk about the ketogenic diet possibly helping more once you have the disease. If you're doing a ketogenic diet to prevent Alzheimer's, you're going to get Alzheimer's. Well, I can't say you're going to get Alzheimer's, but you're going to be at a greater risk, because the diet, when you have Alzheimer's, meaning you aren't getting the absorption of the glucose into the brain, like you have a lot of excess sugar, which is a bad thing. This is going to cause a lot of neuronal damage. We don't want that. Well, they have shown that ketone supplements, low carbohydrates, certain supplements in general, this and a high fiber diet, this is what you do when you have Alzheimer's. So the very diet that actually helps you when you have the disease is not the diet you do to prevent the disease. And if I would have said that to you right away, you all would have been like, okay, what is she talking about? Which is why I do the biochemistry, because when I make that statement to you now, right, when I tell that to you, it's got to make sense, because you now understand the pathology, because you're saying, I get it. Once I have Alzheimer's, I don't do well with sugar. Correct. And if you don't do well with sugar and you are eating a lot of sugar, then what's going to happen is you can have more inflammation. So you do a diet lower in carbs. Ketogenic seems to help with Alzheimer's, and we'll show you some studies on that. And people think, wow, I read a study and I found that ketogenic diet was great for Alzheimer's. I don't have Alzheimer's. I'm going to go ahead and do that. Not a good idea, right? Not a good idea. So when we look at some of the science behind it to treat or not to treat Alzheimer's disease by the ketogenic diet, this is the question. And in this study, it talks about treatment options can be recommended, and the ketogenic diet seems to be one of the last solutions, what they call a good solution. The diet contains large amounts of fats and low carbohydrates, also some vitamin recommendations, which I'll go over. And they have found that this can actually, in this study, it says, can alleviate some of the impaired glucose metabolism that we see with Alzheimer's. And providing ketones can actually be a plus. The ketogenic diet versus the amyloid and tau proteins, because it's those scarring proteins, these plaques, these amyloid plaques that cause the damage to the brain. And basically what they found is that the consumption of the ketogenic diet, when they did it on mice for 43 days, it caused a 25% decrease in these amyloid plaques peptides. So the ketogenic diet has properties to reduce the pathology of the amyloid and tau proteins in some of these mouse models. Plus, a lot of studies with Alzheimer patients, when they did the ketogenic diet, they actually got less symptoms. They got more cognitive, I won't say impaired, they didn't, I can't say that it fixed it, but they had less symptoms occurring, okay? So that to me is interesting, but there's a lot of confusion. I have patients come to me, they read these articles, ketogenic diet for Alzheimer's, and they're doing it because they want to prevent Alzheimer's. So let's just cut the rubber on the road on that one. And so you will have some vitamin mineral deficiencies. I always recommend a B complex with some methylated folate and B12. You want to make sure it says folate and not folic acid, and the B12 is methylated. A good B complex, because you want to get all the B vitamins in there. They're all important. Electrolytes can be low, especially magnesium. Anywhere from 350 to 400 milligrams is what I would suggest. Potassium can be low, but you know what? If you're doing some good veggies, you'll be covered there. Vitamin D, 4,000 IUs. There's been some studies that have shown that vitamin D actually helps with the pathogenesis of Alzheimer's. Vitamin C and vitamin E. These are antioxidants. And there's a lot of other antioxidants that are found in plants. You know, lipoic acid is another one. So these antioxidants actually neutralize the free radicals. So let's go back to that picture so I can show you guys from a chemistry standpoint. So vitamin C and also vitamin E, I recommend 500 milligrams of C. You don't need much more than 100 milligrams of E. So if we go back to the picture of these reactive oxygen species, these antioxidants literally neutralize these guys. And this is a good thing, because if these guys are neutralized, then they can't damage cells. So antioxidants help neutralize the oxidizers. So obviously, if somebody has, well, even if you don't have Alzheimer's disease, I would recommend some good antioxidants. But especially if you do, these are some supplements. Let me find my slide. There we go. See, that's what happens. I lose where I'm at. There we go. So, and then the omega-3 fats also are very instrumental for the brain. So this hopefully helps to see the difference between the different diets and what's required. Now let's go back to, can you test for this? And yes, I did. There is Quest introduces a AD test, detect test now, and it's a blood test, and it can test for some of these amyloid proteins. So that's kind of good that that's coming up. I know that you can get a brain scan also to see how much damage you have. I know that's probably a lot more pricey. Sometimes they don't do that unless they think you have Alzheimer's, which is kind of crazy, because Alzheimer's is one of those things they test for once you have it, right? So that doesn't seem to make a lot of sense to me. But the connection with the ceramides, I think, is interesting, and that the Mayo Clinic and Quest Labs are now coming up with a ceramide test. And I'm trying to get some more information on this, because this to me could be a real indicator for how much damage is really going on, because it's clear that these ceramides are part of the problem with Alzheimer's, cognitive decline, and even, type 2 diabetes. So hopefully you guys learned something in this video, that Alzheimer's disease is connected to diet, okay? It is connected to type 2 diabetes. These ceramides are these fats that accumulate in non-fat tissue, like not your fat cells, and fat cells release free fatty acids, and these fatty acids can start to accumulate in other areas. So it doesn't make sense to eat a diet that has a lot of fats. To me, it just doesn't make sense. It causes an imbalance. You want to try to eat those macronutrients in the right balance. Now, if you have an imbalance, you have epilepsy or you have some clinical issue, that's an imbalance. Alzheimer's disease is an imbalance. So it makes sense that you might need to have a diet that's going to be a little skewed. But it's certainly not. A lot of times with a lot of these clinical imbalances that we have, diseases, you don't do a diet. The same diet that you use for a lot of the diseases is not the diet that typically prevents it. And that's where a lot of the confusion comes in, I think, in the internet, is that gets real confusing. So let's see if we have any other slides here to go over. Yeah, I have two videos I think are really good if you enjoyed this one. Sugar does not cause diabetes. And I do kind of tie in again about the ceramides. I do get a little bit more into the macronutrients, and also athletes getting diabetes. And I have patients that are very confused. They have elevated A1Cs, never before. They can't hardly believe that they have prediabetes, because they're doing everything right. They're doing the Mediterranean diet. They're eating their avocados. They're eating their nuts. They're eating healthy. They're not overweight. They're exercising every day. And in this particular video, I really show how exercise hides type 2 diabetes. It hides it. Because when you exercise, muscles open up and bring all the sugar into that cell, which means that you are not aware that you're having the insulin receptor site being disabled by all these ceramides. You're not aware of it because there's no indication, because they're testing for the wrong things. So I want to try to stay on target with that hour.
We have some questions.
Okay, perfect. Let's go there.
Let me drag that over.
Oh, by the way, let me just show you. You can always go to my website. I'll do a little plug. Myrna Method. I also have my course there. I do a live stream once a week just for my members on learning how to eat to balance your diet. Huge. It's how to get to your leanest weight, your healthiest weight. That's the key, the healthiest. Okay, let's look at some of these questions. Don't forget, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to drop them in the chat. Okay, thanks, Sam. There you go. I'm reading Sam's comment. How do we figure out our ideal body weight? Good question, Wendy. We'll go there. And a few other people were asking the same. And another question, which I'll get to them all. Do you recommend getting the plasma ceramide blood test for measuring ceramide levels in the body as part of annual labs? Absolutely. I am so curious. This is a new test. And I have Dr. Matthijs, which is a physician I work with, getting some information on this test. Yes, I think everybody should have it, considering these ceramides are such a big culprit, right? So I'm interested in seeing how this is going to work. They have different levels. I want more information. Don't have it for you now, but hope to have it soon. Okay, so let's talk about ideal body weight. How do you get to your ideal body weight? Well, I'm going to give you the basic what we're using as dietitians. I think that it probably should be updated a little bit because some of these calculations were done, literally like 40 or 50 years ago. But one of the things they look at, which I have no respect for, but I'm going to tell it to you anyways. Hold on a minute. Let me get out of here and get into my drawing tool, is BMI, body mass index. And this is basically where they figure out what your BMI is, and they say if you are, anywhere from 18, I think, 0.9, I think it's 18.5. I can't remember if it's 18.5 or 8, but to 24. I know this top number because I never have to worry about it being too low. 24.9, this is considered a good BMI. And if you're at this BMI, then you're at your goal weight, okay? And so this, to me, is not a good indicator because you can be really muscular and have a high BMI, and they could consider you obese. In fact, one of the Olympians, the rugby player, she was on YouTube, and she had a BMI of what would be considered obese, a 30 BMI. And she has very low body fat. So BMI takes into consideration your whole body mass and then says, well, you're at your goal weight when we can keep you under 24. But this doesn't hold true if you're super athletic. So unless you get your body fat percentage, we can't really use that. If you are able to get your body fat percentage, I always think that's the best way, because anything under 28% for women and anything under 20% for men, I'm certainly going to say you're at your ideal body weight, okay? So I still didn't answer the question because you're going, okay, I'm just giving you the variables. Let me show you the one I use, and I'll show you how I adjust it. So for women, we take 100 pounds.
It's breaking up a bit.
Okay, there we go. Take 100 pounds as the base, and we take 60 inches, which is 5 feet. And any pound over that, 5 pounds over it, or any inch over that, so every inch over.
Inch of what?
Like if you're 61, if you're 5'1", or you're 5'2", for every inch over 60, you're going to add 5 pounds. So if you are 5'1", your ideal body weight should be 105. If you're 5'8", 8 times 5 is 45, it should be 145. Now, this is considered your leanest weight. But these were done some time ago, and they clearly did not take into consideration muscle because we were not as fit as we were. And if you put a lot of these figures in the BMI, they get very low on the BMI range, like right around the 19 or 20 range of BMI, which for a lot of dietitians, that would be considered low. So what I usually do, if my people are exercising, I can easily add 10 pounds on that, and they can still be well within their ideal body weight. Okay? Now, for men, what we do is it's similar. They use 60 inches as the base, but instead of being 100 pounds, it's 106 pounds, and it's 6 pounds for every inch over 60. So if you're a guy and you are 5'8", we'll use the same thing, right? So you would take, or 5'10" or whatever, you would take 6 times 8 is 48. So it would be 148 plus the 6, which would be like what, 152, 153? And then I would easily add 10 pounds on that. So probably 162 if they were 5'8". Or I'm sorry, 165, within that range. 162 to 165. If they're super muscular and we did the BMI, they may weigh a lot more, right? And that's why we don't use the BMI, because it might show them fatter because they weigh more because they're muscular. But if you're using this because it was done so many years ago, if you are really muscular, you could probably add 10 pounds and maybe for some guys even 15 pounds if they're exercising and really been weightlifting. So I hope that helps. And let's look at how do we get to our macronutrients from this. I'll show you what dietitians use. So if you come up with your ideal, excuse me, I'm trying to get it right. Let's say it's 120 pounds. You divide that by 2.2 to get a kilogram, and on average, you multiply it by 25, or if you're active, 30, and this gives you how many average calories you need to maintain your ideal body weight. I don't have a calculator with me, but
What do you need?
it's 120 times 25
Hold on. 120
times 25.
times 25 is 3,000.
No, that can't be right.
What?
Oh, wait. I'm sorry. 120 divided by 2.2. Okay, there we go. Follow your instructions. And then multiply that by 25. And then, so 120 divided by 2.2, and then multiply that by 25.
2.2.
Take 120 divided by 2.2,
I did.
and then multiply that by 25.
I did.
What'd you come up with?
So 120 divided by 2.2 is 54.
Okay.
And then multiply by 25 is 1,363.
Okay. So they're saying to weigh 120 pounds, this would be your lowest activity rate. And then I usually multiply that by 1.2. Or if they're active, I take 54, Samantha, and multiply that by 30.
Take what number?
54 multiplied by 30.
54 multiplied by 30. 1,602.20.
Okay. So this could be probably a more realistic amount, but that's basically, as dietitians, how we figure it out. And not that that really matters with AD, but you asked the question and I wanted to make sure that I answered it. So hopefully, Wendy, that helped.
Mm-hmm.
So Sam, you got the chat up. Is there any questions?
No, that's about it.
All right.
Don't forget to like and subscribe.
Okay. Yeah. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Hit those buttons. Thank you guys.
All right.
All right. Awesome. Good?
Yeah.
Okay.